The views and content expressed on the Pop Culture Courtroom are provided solely for educational and entertainment purposes and do not constitute legal advice. For any legal matters, please consult with a licensed attorney. Welcome back to the Pop Culture Courtroom. I'm Katie Zaccardi.
And I'm Michael Kilgore.
And we are taking over today for Matt Hardin and William Mayfield to talk about something very fun and relevant, which is Wicked / The Wizard of Oz. So for those of you who don't know The Wizard of Oz, where have you been? But if you don't know Wicked...
no introduction.
Yeah, exactly. Like, come on. If you don't know Wicked, Wicked is basically a musical that is the prequel, if you will, the unofficial prequel to The Wizard of Oz. It is based on a book that was turned into a musical, and it tells the story of the Wicked Witch of the West, also known as Elphaba in the show, and how she became the Wicked Witch.
And it turns out she's been through quite a lot.
Quite a lot. Yes. So as the resident theater nerd and musical enthusiast here, we are going to talk all about this today. And the thing is, when you dive into it, here on the podcast, we're here to talk about personal injury and what claims can be made, if any, what lawsuits might be made, who's causing harm to people in things like pop culture, movies, films, TV. And there's a lot here.
Yeah, there are quite a few issues that are going on in Wicked. And it's kind of interesting to see how they would play out in a courtroom.
Yeah. So let's start. I'm going to take this off because I already can't focus on what's going on. So let's start with the very first thing that basically sets all this up, which is Elphaba, again, aka Wicked Witch of the West, being born green. Mm-hmm. In the musical, pretty early on, we find out that Elphaba's mother is married to her father, who is in a government position of Munchkin Land. And when her father is traveling one day, Elphaba's mother has a relationship with an unknown figure who we later in the show find out is actually the wizard. And during their encounter, he gives her a green elixir. So she drinks it. 9 months later, her mother's having a kid. The baby comes out green. It's Elphaba. The dad and everyone around are horrified. And this one singular thing basically sets Elphaba's life up to be what it is. Mm-hmm. She is ridiculed from the moment she's born, basically. Her father essentially hates her and resents her. And many following events happen because of the wizard's actions. So we're going to dive into this.
And I have lots of questions because I'm not as much of an expert on Wicked.
Okay, go on.
So did the mother, what was the reason the mother drank the elixir?
It's really not given. It's kind of just like he walks in and he's like, hey, drink this. And she's like, all right, sure.
I mean, it sounds a little bit kind of like a date drug that you hear about these days.
Yeah, he's like, hey, just take this drink. And she's like, yeah, I trust you, no problem.
Wow.
But yeah, so she was very trusting of him.
Okay. And do you think he was acting in his capacity as wizard or as her significant other?
That's a great question. I don't think he was acting as a wizard.
Okay.
I don't even know. I mean, we make the assumption that at this point he was the wizard because it's sort of implied that like once he gets to Oz, pretty much immediately he is like raised to this high power by the people and that he becomes the wizard. But technically speaking, we don't even know if he is the wizard at this point or if he's just a guy. It is referenced later on that he's like, oh, I used to travel a lot. Mm-hmm. I just, in my prior job as snake oil salesman or whatever he did, he traveled a lot. So there is also an implication there that like maybe he was just passing through. He wasn't the wizard yet. He was just passing through town and they met, or whenever he came to her town, they saw each other. Mm-hmm. But we don't actually have all that information.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to think about how there used to be snake oil salesmen way back in the day who would travel around and open up their little carts and sell these magic elixirs on the side of the road.
Yeah.
And there would be very little government regulation, right?
Yeah.
I was researching for this podcast and found that doctors and pharmacists have been licensed as early as the 1800s. So that does go back further than I was expecting it to. But if this guy was just kind of selling things out of the side of his vehicle or his horse and buggy, then, you have to wonder, well, was he holding himself out as a pharmacist or as a doctor or a physician of some kind?
Yeah.
What kind of role was he playing back then?
Or did he just give it to her just
Yeah.
because?
Yeah.
And it's also not clear what it's supposed to do. In the song, he basically just says, have a drink of this green elixir, and we'll have ourselves a little mixer. Like, we have no idea what this thing is. We don't know what it's supposed to do.
Yeah.
And this is the other part of it. Did he intend to have a child with her? Like, that probably was not his intention. I don't think he gave it to her knowing that it was going to do anything, that she was going to get pregnant, or that the baby would then be green. But the fact is, all of those things did happen.
Yeah.
So does that make him at fault for this?
I would want to know, what did he mean by we'll have ourselves a little mixer? Are we going to mix our DNA? Are we going to mix social company?
Yeah.
What kind of mixing are we doing?
Yeah. Yeah. Take him to court and get him to clarify exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And has he ever had mixers before? Where did he get this elixir from? Was it from a friend, or did he make it himself? Lots of questions about this elixir.
And the other thing, too, is he has no power. The wizard in this world, and you learn this in The Wizard of Oz, it's not really a surprise. He is a fraud. He is a snake oil salesman. He has no real power. So how did he even get this?
Yeah.
And is it magic? Is it just a drink? Like, we really have absolutely no answers here that we would have to find out.
And that's a good point. You see that in The Wizard of Oz, too, where he's a total fraud. Once they pull the curtain back on him, you see that he's just a kind old man, and he just gives Dorothy and her friends little trinkets that really are symbolic at most. So in this case, though, he did cause harm with what he gave her. And so you would have to look at a claim between both the mother and the wizard. The mother unknowingly took this drink not expecting to cause her baby any consequences, then I doubt you could really go after her. But for him, I think you could look at a medical malpractice claim if he was acting as a physician or a pharmacist and was licensed as one. And a med mal claim is really just a little bit more of a complicated negligence claim. You have to prove that he had a duty, that he breached that duty, that the breach caused damage, and you've got a negligence claim there. Something that makes med mal claims a little different than a normal negligence claim, though, is that you have to show that there was a legal standard of care in that area that he fell under. And so you have to ask, well, what was the going practice in those days for elixirs? Were there rules and regulations, and did people follow certain procedures? So what was really going on in Oz in that day with elixirs that are used for mixers?
We need these answers.
Yeah.
How would you even get these answers? Would you have to do a deposition with the wizard?
We would have to file a lawsuit and start doing depositions and written discovery. We would send him written questions and ask about this elixir, and then we would have a deposition where we would put him under the lights and ask him whatever we want to ask him.
So we find out that he is Elphaba's real father towards the end of Wicked. And then very shortly after, he's essentially banished. In The Wizard of Oz, he goes in his hot air balloon. He's supposed to take Dorothy home. She hops out to go get Toto, and he's like, oopsies, I'm leaving in this hot air balloon without you. And in Wicked, Glinda is like, you got to get out of here. Like, you are... And there's a lot more that goes into that, but he's basically causing chaos. He's discriminating against animals, which we'll talk about in a second. But she's like, you better get gone. And he leaves. So he's not there. And Elphaba really has, all she has is the bottle that the elixir came from. She knows that that's her mother's, but she doesn't know until later on that he is her father. Who knows if she's even putting two and two together that, like, he could be why she's green. But if she's finding this out when she's, I don't know, 20 or 25, because it's after school, it's after college, can she even put a claim forth at this point, or is it, and then the wizard's gone? Like, what could we even do?
Yeah, you would have to really talk about whether or not she's too old to make that claim. So if you are injured as a minor, your parents can bring a claim on your behalf, but at the very latest, the statute of limitations begins to run after you become an adult. So conceivably, her chance to sue him could have been over at the age of 19. So it's 18 plus, and the statute starts running and it's over at 19. So she may have missed her chance there. The fact that he's her father really changes things. I mean, it makes it definitely more complicated. Now, the mother could have made a claim of intentional assault by the fact that he gave her this to drink and it caused damage. That's a little bit more of a creative type claim.
Yeah.
But you have to think about how he caused her damage by having her drink this elixir. So an intentional assault is a little bit simpler.
Yeah.
And it gets around some of the complications of a med-mal case.
So this is the other thing. You tell me if I'm reaching here. But basically, the series of events that happens after Elphaba is born green is that when Elphaba's parents go to have a second child, her dad is so paranoid that he feeds the mom a bunch of milk flowers.
Yeah.
So the milk flowers make her sister come early, and the sister essentially is born paralyzed because her legs are all tangled because she came early. And then the mom, it says she never woke up. So presumably she went into a coma at childbirth, lost a lot of blood, and then ends up dying from this. So is that his fault? Is it the wizard's fault because of just the domino effect of what he put into action? And then Elphaba spends her whole life blaming herself for that, and when it's not her fault that she was born this way.
Yeah, I really can't stretch the wizard's liability to the baby that was born with the tangled legs.
Yeah.
You know, they made their own decisions. Just because you're afraid of what someone else did doesn't mean you can act unreasonably. So I don't think the wizard is on the hook for.
So in terms of Elphaba potentially making a claim, it's really just that her skin is green. And the emotional damage that she suffered because everybody scorned her for it, basically.
Yeah, and any kind of damage she received from her skin being green, she could claim. Did she lose jobs because of green skin? Did it damage her ability to earn income over her life? We talked about how it caused emotional damage. That would have to be documented by a professional. So, you know, if she's just crying in her bedroom at home, that's not actionable so much as if she required therapy.
Yeah.
That where it's documented that she had trouble eating and sleeping and forming relationships with people. It really has to be documented well, something like that. Another harm that she could maybe seek damages for is that physical damages like scars, and in her case, her skin being green, are more valuable for women in our society because of the emphasis that is placed on looks for women. So I've seen where if a woman gets a scar from an accident, that scar is more valuable. If she gets it on her face, it's more valuable than if a man were to get the scar.
Huh.
So that would increase her damages in her favor. But, you know, she'd have to bring the claim before she's 19, before she's 20.
It's not looking good for Elphaba in that case, but
it's a tough sell.
luckily,
She's got to find an attorney.
Magical, so
She'll have to find an attorney who will sue under a case like this, which might be hard.
A little bit. Let's move on to incident number 2.
Okay.
Which I really want to talk about. This is something that Wicked goes into way more than The Wizard of Oz. In fact, The Wizard of Oz doesn't touch on this at all. But in Wicked, animals in this world can speak. They essentially can live the lives of humans. There is a goat named Dr. Dillamond who is a professor. He can speak, he can teach, and we learn that during this time that Elphaba and Glinda are going to school at Chiz University, someone is trying to silence the animals. So animals are getting captured. They are losing their power of speech. We don't exactly know how, except it's Dr. Dillon basically just says, like, anyone who's scared enough can suppress that.
Yeah.
And technically they're animals, but are they? Because they're living human lives. So there's two things that happen in particular. The first is that Dr. Dillamond, the teacher, he is eventually captured and taken away in the middle of class. We later in the show see that he has been in captivity with the wizard and he can no longer speak. Then in that same school session where Dr. Dillamond is taken away, someone else brings in a little baby lion cub, and they're like, look at this. It's called a cage. It's where we're going to keep these animals so that they can't do stuff anymore. So over the years, they have been slowly suppressing animals and taking away their rights, taking away their power, if you will. My question is there anything we can do about this? Because they're not humans, but in this world, like, they're also not just animals. They are living these normal lives, and then they go on to be abused. And not only mentally, but also physically. Like, the lion cub is in the cage, and then it's not... I did see the movie, so if you guys have seen the movie, they don't quite hurt him. They kind of, like, smack the cage. In the Broadway production, it's a little bit more... outward, where it looks like they're really kind of like whipping the lion. Yeah. But there's some physical harm happening.
My first question would be that we have to decide what world we're living in. Are we looking at this under the culture and the society of Oz, or are we looking at it in our current culture in the United States of America? We'll look at it both ways.
Yeah.
In Oz, since animals are professors and they're living more human lives, I would think that their laws would reflect that. It might be a law that basically just says that animals are treated the same as humans in Oz.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then obviously putting them in cages and abusing them in different ways would definitely be illegal, both in the criminal sense and the civil sense. So a lot of times, if you're injured by somebody, you may have both a criminal course of action where the government would penalize that person in some way, maybe send them to jail, or a civil cause of action where you get money damages, and they both run on different tracks. So I would think that those laws would be in place if they're rising to the level of professor.
Yeah.
Now, in the United States, present day, there are animal cruelty laws. There are criminal penalties for those things. They go from misdemeanor to felony, especially if it's intentional. If it's an intentional act of animal cruelty, it's going to be way, way more serious.
Yeah, which it seems like this is. I mean, they're basically telling people, oh, don't worry, everything's totally fine. We're just going to, like, slowly take all these animals away and hold them in captivity or make them so afraid that they can no longer do what they used to do. Yeah. So there is clearly intention there. Can the animals make claims? Because this other thing, it's like happening by the government. Oz, we find out that the wonderful Wizard of Oz is the one basically facilitating all of this. And even to the point where later on in the musical, at the end of Act 1, or if you watch the new movie that just came out, it's basically at the end of the movie, which you should go see. It's brilliant. But they essentially con Elphaba into proving herself in front of the wizard and showing that she can do magic. And she turns all of the monkeys, who are the wizard's guards, into flying monkeys. So that's how they become flying monkeys.
Oh,
and
I see.
They're like, oh, perfect. They're going to be great spies. And she's like, whoa, excuse me? What did you say? And they're like, oh, scouts. They're going to be great scouts. Like, they're just going to see what's going on in Oz, and they're going to report back any animal activity that isn't what we want it to be. And, I mean, spoiler alert, but that's basically when Elphaba's like, I'm not doing this. Yeah. I'm fighting for the rights of the animals. You can't control me. And now I'm going to fly away on my broom and defy gravity. So not only is he in control of this, he's trying to monitor everyone and decreasing the quality of life of all of these animals.
If laws are in place, they can bring an action against the government. In most states, you have something called the GTLA, the Government Tort Liabilities Act. And that removes something called sovereign immunity from the government for certain things. So normally the government has sovereign immunity, which means you can't sue the government over just anything. But if they are negligent, for example, something we see in our practice a lot is if a government employee has a car accident while in the scope of their employment, then the government that they work for would be liable. And so if there's a statute that says sovereign immunity will be removed for certain things, then they could sue. One problem would be that if this is considered an intentional act of placing animals in bondage or in cages or whatever it might be, then insurance protection might be removed. And that happens a lot with just everybody's auto insurance as well. If you're caught racing and you have an accident when you're racing, or if you see your ex-boyfriend in front of you and you hit the gas and want to run him over, then those types of intentional acts would not be covered by your insurance and you would be out of pocket for those damages. So we have to look at whether it's an intentional act and whether there's a Government Tort Liability Act that gives you the power to sue the government in that situation.
On that note, one final tidbit about the animals is that the lion that is in the class ends up escaping, or getting help escaping, I should say, because Elphaba essentially casts a spell or causes chaos, and she is able to take the lion out of the cage. Her and Fiyero, who is another classmate that they're in school with, who at the time is sort of dating Glinda but is friends with them both. The two of them take the lion out and go set it free. And that lion cub essentially grows up to be the cowardly lion. And the way they go about explaining that is like, oh, he's so afraid because she set him free. He never learned how to fight his own battles. So he became a coward. Now, I don't really think that there's anything there that he could like blame for, again, except for emotional damage, because on the one hand she really saved him from physical damage and being in captivity his whole life, but on the other hand now he is a very, very scaredy cat.
Yeah, that one would be really difficult because again it would have to be documented some way, and you'd have to have some kind of developmental psychologist come in and talk about, the
This
childhood
lion
that he missed that caused him to be the way that he is. I've never seen a case like that. I don't
You've
know.
never seen a case where a lion had to go to therapy to prove that he was in distress?
I'm afraid not.
How odd. Okay, so I think that pretty much covers the animal side of things.
Yeah.
So the last thing we're going to talk about is multi-parted, and what I'm calling it is spells that do damage, because we are obviously working within the world of magic here, and there are several instances where somebody casts a spell and that spell ends up doing harm to another person, even if the spell in some cases was well intended. So we're going to start with Bach to Tinman. If you've seen The Wizard of Oz, you're aware of who the Tinman is. If you know Wicked, you probably know who Bach is, but if you haven't seen Wicked yet, Bach is another schoolmate that Elphaba and Glinda and Fiyero, as previously mentioned, went to school with. He is notoriously in love with Glinda, and along the 5 or so years that this show covers, his fate basically becomes that he is I will call him the assistant or the right-hand man to Nessa Rose, who is Elphaba's sister, the Wicked Witch of the East. As we previously mentioned, she is paralyzed. She's in a wheelchair. Glinda, at some point early on in the show, Bach's in love with Glinda. She's like, hey, go ask Nessa to the dance. She kind of pawns him off on Nessa because she doesn't want to deal with him. Nessa keeps him around. She won't let him go. Eventually, Elphaba and Nessa's father dies. Nessa she rises up to that government position in Munchkinland. I think she's the mayor or the governor. And she goes off the rails, and she's taking the rights away from Munchkins. We can't even get into that today, but she's going crazy. She won't let Bach go, okay? So then after some time has passed and Elphaba comes back to see her sister after she had kind of escaped, and she was like, I can't do this. I'm not going to work for the wizard. So I'm going to go bye-bye because everyone's trying to capture her. She casts a spell to... Sorry, this is a very long-winded explanation, but I think the context is necessary. She casts a spell to allow Nessa to walk because she comes back and Nessa's like, girl, you did all this stuff and you couldn't have gotten me out of this wheelchair for your own sister. So she does it, and she gets, the ruby slippers, and she's able to walk. And basically the second that happens, she calls Bach in, and Bach's like, oh, cool, you can walk? I'm out of here. I do not want to be here anymore. You've been holding me captive. I'm in love with Glinda. I have to go tell Glinda that I love her. Goodbye. And Nessa, also a witch, but who has basically, as far as we know, has not really harnessed or trained any of her power, just goes into like a blind rage and ends up shrinking Bach's heart. Okay? So he's gonna die because he has no heart. Then 2 seconds later, she's like, oh my God, what'd I do? Oops, didn't mean to do that. And then, so Elphaba's like, okay, let me fix this. And she turns him into the Tin Man. And as soon as he wakes up as the Tin Man, he's like, you're both evil. I don't like this. I'm miserable. I'm made of tin. This stinks.
Yeah.
And later on in the play, we see him riling people up even more so to be like, we need to capture the witch. She's evil. So all of that to say... It was Nessa Rose who cast the original spell to shrink his heart.
Yeah.
And then it was Elphaba who cast the spell to make him the Tin Man in an effort to keep him alive. But it still ended up ruining his life, you could say. I mean, who wants to be made of tin,
Yeah, and, it really doesn't matter what the motive is, because what you're doing in both situations is you are imposing a future on someone without their consent. You're stealing that freedom from them, and that has to be worth something in the Oz society. I would be surprised if Oz didn't have laws about spells, given how everyone is like pointing their wand at everyone and, doing all these things. Regardless of the motive for the spell, it's like, what if you had a gun in our society? And rather than a magic wand, you've got a gun and you're shooting bullets at different things. When you get trained to use a gun, you're told you better be prepared to pay for whatever that bullet touches, whether it is property or a person. If you're defending yourself, then in some cases, you might be protected from having to pay for it. But if you miss someone and you put a hole in the wall somewhere, you're going to have to pay for that hole in the wall. And it's the same principle here.
Yeah.
You're going to be responsible for the spells you cast, regardless of the motive that is behind it. I actually Googled whether in our society, whether casting spells is illegal or not. And I couldn't find any laws on it.
Oh.
So I thought that was interesting. You'd have a real tough time with causation here. You would have to prove that, yes, someone in fact did cast a spell, which is like a supernatural thing. You can't put your hand on it. It's not like a bullet in our society. And you would have to show that spell actually caused what the damage is.
Yeah.
And you would have to show it was a direct cause of the damage. So
they do have a spell book that Elphaba is working out of. So that could potentially show that there is a spell that she was reading, and aka magic. But yeah, I mean, it's not like, aside from Nessa watching her do it, so she could testify against her sister, I guess. Although she can't anymore because she's actually dead via house. But we have like some things we can point to, but not, like you said, it's not super tangible.
Yeah, you see how the proof kind of falls apart when you're trying to think of how to prove a case. It would be difficult, but maybe in Oz, if spells are illegal, there could be statutes that show what proof is acceptable and what's not, and what could be shown. In some cases, you could have a spell expert come in and testify, and they could testify to a reasonable degree of witchcraft certainty that the spell did cause the damage.
Yeah.
Then you're in business. So a lot of it depends on the culture and the society that you live in.
Yeah. I could see that happening.
Yeah. I mean, if there was going to be a sequel to Wicked, it should be like a courtroom drama where some of these things play out and you can kind of see how Oz would deal with it.
They're all like putting themselves against each other, like
Yeah.
trying to but what's funny about that too is that like in Wicked specifically, there's a lot about just propaganda where it's like the wizard and his team are telling everyone one thing and what's actually happening is something separate.
Yeah.
So, yeah, to get everyone in court under oath to be able to say, here's what actually happened.
Yes.
Would be interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so number 2 of spells that do damage, we have Fiero to Scarecrow. So I've mentioned Fiero before. He's a classmate. He's also a prince. And he becomes the Scarecrow. And how this happens is he is essentially trying to help Elphaba escape. And as he's doing that, he gets captured by the guards. That's the simplest explanation of what happens. So the wizard's guards take him away, and Elphaba, in probably my favorite song of the show, sings No Good Deed, where she is trying to stop him from being harmed. But at this point, it's like she is just working with what she got. She is reading out of a book, but it does seem that in this world of magical spells, she only has so much control because she's not able to just be like, he's immortal or he will never be hurt physically. The spell that she casts and the words that she uses, it's let his bones never break, let them never destroy him, let him never die. So seems simple. The way that manifests is that he is turned into a scarecrow. He no longer has bones. He no longer can be beaten to death because he's a scarecrow.
Yeah.
So not to spoil anything, but I'm going to spoil it right now. So if you haven't seen Wicked and you want to wait for part 2 of the movie to come out, cover your ears. We know that he is in love with Elphaba. She is in love with him. They end up escaping together. Happy ending. So he ultimately, like, thanks her. He's not mad that he's a scarecrow because he's like, you kept me alive. Very, very different from Bach. Bach is like, I hate you. Scarecrow is like, you kept me alive. Now we can be together. So presumably he would not even put a claim forth against Elphaba, but it sounds like it's the same thing here where she only had so much control over what she did. And she did inflict something upon him that he didn't choose, but because of their personal relationship, she's lucky because she's probably just going to get away with doing that because he's not going to sue her.
She probably will, but the legal words that I was thinking of as you described this are that it was such a reckless thing to do. And that's what you see with a lot of these spells. They accomplish one purpose, but then they create 3 more problems when they're executed.
Yeah.
And it's a very reckless way to try to problem solve. And it's a way that attempts to solve a problem without the person's input that's getting the spell. You could say it's reckless. You could say she acted with a wanton disregard for his well-being. If he wanted to sue her, he could, I think, definitely recover some damages for how it changes his body and the consequences of that.
Yeah. Doesn't sound like he's gonna.
Yeah.
Because he plotted with her to leave. The other thing, too, is like, we don't know the extent of this because when he's with Dorothy, he's like, I don't have a brain. I don't have anything. He's still somehow thinking and walking and doing human-like things, but it seems like there could be a lot of physical damage. He could definitely. Plus, he was a prince. He was a prince. He came from a wealthy, known family, and now everyone basically thinks he's dead because he can't identify as himself anymore. He has to just live his life as the Scarecrow. So he can't have any of the other perks that he would have had of life either.
Yeah, it's kind of isolated him from his former life, and that's a problem.
Yeah. All right. Heading into our last example here, we've got Madame Morrible the Murderer. So, Madame Morrible in Wicked is a professor and then later becomes the press secretary to the wizard. She is the one who is training Elphaba to be a witch in the first place and learn how to use her power for good, even though she ends up being a bit of a traitor herself. And what she does, really the biggest thing she does, besides just being a bad person who's on the wizard's side, is that she ends up casting a spell to get Elphaba back. So they're trying to recapture Elphaba. She knows too much. They gave her the 411 on all the evil stuff they were doing, thinking that Elphaba would help them with her powers, and she won't do it because it's all bad. So Elphaba's been gone and missing, and they're trying to get her back. So Madame Morrible says, what better way to get her back than to use her sister? Actually, I think it's Glinda that gives them this idea, which is a little shady of Glinda. But Madame Morrible's like, perfect. Weather is my specialty. I'm going to just whip up a little tornado here. And she does a spell that causes the tornado that rips up Dorothy's house and plops the house on top of the Wicked Witch of the East, Nessa Rose, and in essence, murders her.
Yeah.
So, what the heck?
So, was she acting in her capacity as the press secretary for the wizard?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, she wasn't doing anything press oriented, but I think that's really just a formal title to say she's his sidekick and they're doing bad stuff together.
Oh, wow. Okay. Then the Government Tort Liability Act would apply if you get around the intentional act.
Okay.
This was, an intentional act of picking up the house and dropping it on the sister.
Yeah.
So in that case, it may not provide any coverage, and that's the deep pocket. That's what the Government Tort Liability Act is, where you can access the insurance coverage of the government. And if you can't access that, then you have to go after this lady individually. And unless she's just independently wealthy, unless she has a lot of land that's not attached to her home, then it's going to be difficult to collect on any judgment that you win against her for both the property damage to the house and for the murder. Now, she definitely could be brought up on murder charges in the criminal aspect.
Yeah.
But, there may not be any money.
So what you're saying is if they can prove that she was doing that as a government act, which she was pretty much, like her and the wizard are like, yeah, we're going to do this. And she's like, I know a way. And he's not like, no, don't. She's like, here we go.
Yeah.
So that seems like it was intentional from the government. Then you can sue the government. But if she had a personal vendetta against Nessa Rose and outside of work did it, then you can't sue the government.
I mean, I'm just not buying the idea that this was an official government act, because you would have to show that her normal job is to move houses, for example. If part of her job description is that she moves houses from one place to another by supernatural means, then you're in business. Oops, the house accidentally dropped on a person. Then you're good. But moving houses is probably not a normal task for her.
But come on. In her role as government person, the task at hand is get Elphaba here. So she just does what she thinks she needs to do to get Elphaba here.
For a government purpose?
Yeah.
I mean, you could argue that.
Well, I mean,
You
I
could
don't
argue
know.
that. I mean-
What's considered a government purpose? Because I guess the purpose is that they want to put her in jail or like capture her or use.
You've lost me again. Here's an example here. I've heard of a case where a government employee was driving under the influence of alcohol, and the Government Tort Liability Act did not apply to that situation because that driver, while they were driving as a government employee in their capacity, were drunk. And so that was considered an intentional act, and it was outside the scope of the GTLA. So it's a very fine line, but I just don't see us getting across that line here. So we better hope this lady has lots of money.
Well, that's really disappointing to me.
Yeah. Now, criminally, she's still on the hook.
Okay.
So it sounds like she caused this lady's death.
Yeah.
It's some level of homicide. So she's definitely going away.
Yeah.
And
she does, by the way. Actually, Glinda sends her, which, do we know exactly how? Glinda is like promoted to Glinda the Good just by the wizard for good morale. And then she ends up basically banishing the Wizard of Oz and sending Madame Morrible to jail.
Yeah.
Because she comes in and she's like, I've had enough of you two. Get out of here.
Yeah.
So she does actually get served justice.
Uh-huh.
But this is what I was actually thinking about when I was rewatching The Wizard of Oz. You have Dorothy thinking she committed 2 murders in the span of this whole situation, because she gets to Oz, she gets to Munchkinland, and they're like, you put your house on the Wicked Witch. Look, there's all that's left of her. It's her feet and her legs.
Yeah.
And she's just like, oops, I didn't mean to.
Yeah.
And then later on, she throws the bucket of water, which I have a lot of questions about that, but then I don't. Because you're like, why is there a bucket of water in the Wicked Witch of the West's castle just chilling there? If you've seen Wicked, Fiyero and Elphaba have concocted this plan because the wizard has put this propaganda out that she can melt by water. So they're like, great, we're going to use that. We're going to get her to go through like a trap door so that they all think she died and melted. But really, we're just going to use that as an escape.
Yeah.
So I would imagine that that bucket of water was carefully planted there. Without that knowledge, it's like, why would, if she really was meltable, why would there be a giant bucket of water just hanging out there?
You would think she would banish water.
You'd think.
All kinds of water.
Yeah, not allowed in the castle. So then this is a second death that she technically didn't cause, because the first death would have been Madame Morrible's spell that caused it in the world of Wicked, of course. And then the second death in the world of Wicked would be that Elphaba didn't actually die. She just tricked her into thinking of dying.
Yeah.
But if you watch Wizard of Oz, Dorothy's just like, oops, I didn't mean to. The second time, you committed 2 murders. And she's completely unbothered by it.
Hold on, because Dorothy didn't have any control over where her house landed. Right?
Yeah, but don't you think that she would have walked away from that situation being like, dang, that stinks?
Well, she's a young girl. She's got her own problems. She's trying to get home. I don't know. I
don't buy it.
The water thing, that was a pretty scary moment in The Wizard of Oz. You could say she was acting in self-defense, maybe. I don't remember exactly what was going on in that scene.
No, she wasn't. Because Elphaba, the Wicked Witch of the West, did a spell or something, and she basically put Scarecrow / Fiyero on fire.
Oh, that's right.
So again, the way we would assume this from Wicked is that they were in on this together, and it was like all part of their plan.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm gonna put him on fire. Dorothy's gonna take the bucket, try to throw it on him. It's gonna hit me. I'm gonna die.
Yeah.
Right. But it wasn't really self-defense. I mean, I guess you could say she was defending Scarecrow because she was trying to put him out. But she throws the bucket to put the fire out, and part of it goes on the Wicked Witch, and she melts.
Yeah, so that's definitely defense of another. And, there wasn't any intent there if she's trying to put out Scarecrow's fire and some water gets on the witch.
Yeah, that's fair.
Dorothy gets a pass.
I just think Dorothy's walking out of Oz, like, somehow involved with the death of 2 people. I guess she's being celebrated because they're both allegedly evil. So nobody really cares. They all think she did something good, but
You've got some anger against Dorothy here. Where's this coming from?
I don't know.
Dorothy needs an advocate.
I think I was just surprised that in watching it back that she seems to have no emotional reaction besides being like, I didn't mean to do it. I didn't mean to do it.
I mean, she's glad that two witches are out of commission.
Yeah.
She's rid the world of 2 mean witches.
Yeah.
So.
Well, good for her then, I guess.
She's a hero in Oz.
That she is.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to make a statue of her. All right. Well, any last thoughts before we dive into our irrelevant evidence?
I think we've covered these issues pretty thoroughly.
And you know what else I was thinking of, though, is you were telling me, which I think is so true, how Glenda makes her go on this whole rabbit chase. And then she comes back at the end of the movie and she's like,
Yes.
just click your heels.
Now, we didn't talk about any actions against Glenda because Glenda could have mitigated Dorothy's damages by telling her to click her heels at the beginning of the movie rather than the end.
Yeah.
And she went through all these hard things, which you could argue were good for her.
That's kind of what she says at the end. She's like,
Yeah.
I could have told you that, but you wouldn't have believed me because you had to learn that home is what your true heart's desire was all this time.
Yeah. Well, maybe there wouldn't be a cause of action against Glenda, but that was kind of mean, you know. It was a tough love approach for sure. Yeah.
I think Glenda did a lot of things that were questionable, but not she was just doing her best.
Yeah.
And I feel like at that point in the show, she's just in the show of Wicked, she's just found out that Elphaba is back and her fiance Fiyero and Elphaba are in love with each other and are gonna basically run away together, and then Fiyero dies, or she thinks he dies, and Elphaba also dies. So she's going through a lot.
I think Glenda's got the edge over everybody in the way she presents herself. You know, she wears pink, she smiles, and she says she's the good witch of the north. And so nobody's suspecting that she's actually causing some bad things around there.
Yeah.
So she could be the wickedest witch of them all.
You heard it here first. No, I don't actually. I think Glenda is relatively harmless, but is just sort of caught in the fire of everything. Because she's even with Elphaba. I mean, she's on Elphaba's side this whole time, and she's with Elphaba when she leaves, like during Defying Gravity. She's about to go with her until the guards come, and she's like, I can't actually go with you, but like I love you, and go do your thing.
Yeah.
But then immediately she's like I don't want to say she's like with the wizard, because she's not really supporting what he's doing, but she is again elevated to this position of power, sort of with Madame Morrible. She's allowing them to like say all this propaganda, and she's like, I just got to keep the people happy. Like, we just got to keep the people happy. Elphaba's gone. It is what it is. I miss her, but so I don't know. She's not really committing any crimes, but she's also not really advocating for anyone in any effective way. So she's just trying to keep the vibes good, I guess, while everything else is in disarray.
Yeah.
And we can't blame her for that.
Yeah, I guess not. Everybody's out for something in Oz.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so for our irrelevant evidence today, we're going to talk about all of the injuries on the Wizard of Oz set.
One thing I was thinking of is that in the Wizard of Oz movie, that was like a workers' compensation nightmare.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
So you've got the Tin Man who had lifelong injury from the silver paint that he had to wear. The Wicked Witch being burned by some of the fireworks that they used on her.
Mm-hmm. The set itself is kind of said to be cursed. A lot of bad things happened, and like you said, a lot of people came out injured.
Yeah.
So we've got the original Tin Man, Buddy Ebsen, was poisoned by aluminum dust from his makeup. Mm-hmm. His replacement, Jack Haley, also had respiratory issues, and the internet says an eye infection as well from it. Ray Bolger, who was the Scarecrow, had scars from his rubber mask. And probably the worst of it is that Margaret Hamilton, the Wicked Witch, her green makeup was highly toxic, and it took months to fade. Like, after filming, she was just still green for months because the makeup wouldn't come off.
And as if that's not bad enough, in the poppies scene, you've got asbestos raining down as snow.
Yeah.
So yeah, that movie might be one of the most expensive movies of all time if you count all of the injuries that were incurred on that set.
So we're not supposed to be talking about suing at this point, but like, do all of those people have workers' comp claims?
100%. You know, you've got to weigh something like that, especially in Hollywood, against your career, because if you're going to make a big claim against a movie studio, there were only a few studios at the time. You know, everybody may be afraid to work with you going forward. So,
well, I remember reading something where it said Margaret Hamilton, who was the Wicked Witch, she was like typecast. She was apparently this very nice person.
Yeah.
I think it was Judy Garland said she was like the nicest person to her on set, despite playing the witch. But she, I think, had a lot of trouble afterwards, just growing her career because she played that iconic character. It was just hard to get away from it.
Yeah.
So maybe she wouldn't mind suing the studio, but yeah, for everyone else, because then especially at that time in the 30s and 40s, like there's a couple studios, they're all very well connected. Yeah. You don't want to make enemies of a higher up there because you basically would get blacklisted. Exactly. And never work again.
Yeah, I mean, it's really an amazing movie. And I mean, I think it speaks to its greatness that it hasn't been remade in over 100 years. Or right at 100 years. I don't know when it was made.
That's such a good point. I mean, you had other interpretations, like you had The Wiz, and obviously you have Wicked with the, you know, this sort of side story. But I do hope that in Wicked Part 2, the movie, they will give us a couple glimpses of it, and they've already sort of alluded to that in Part 1. We see like 2 seconds where there might be a little Dorothy in there. Wow. And immediately I was like, cool. I was like already crying. I'm like sitting in the theater, like so excited. The overture's playing. I don't want to spoil it for anyone. You guys have to go see this, okay? I know on this podcast we've been talking a lot about golf and 80s movies, but this is a pop culture courtroom. Pop culture right now is Wicked. You've got to go see it. But there's this absolutely beautiful shot where you get a little Wizard of Oz. Yeah. And I'm hoping, because in Wicked Act 2 of the Broadway show, they do, it overlaps. It very clearly overlaps. So I'm like holding out a lot of hope that we get some Wizard of Oz in there.
When is Wicked 2 coming out?
Next year.
Okay, next year.
So we've got a little bit to wait, but it's fine. The first movie is 2 hours and 40 minutes, so we can just endlessly rewatch that.
That is really long.
It doesn't feel long though. I will say that.
Yeah.
I mean, granted, I am a big fan of the show, so I was very excited going into it, but it's paced very well and it moves along. Yeah. So it kind of just gives the ability to dive a little bit deeper into all of the scenes that happen without it feeling like you're actually sitting there for 3 hours.
Yeah. That's good.
It felt like an hour and a half.
We'll see.
Well, if you guys watch it, or if you're already a fan of Wicked, or you're a fan of The Wizard of Oz, let us know. DM me on Instagram, Matt Hardin Law. I'll be answering everyone's DMs, and let us know how you liked this episode. But otherwise, that concludes our takeover of the Pop Culture Courtroom. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
See you next time.
The Pop Culture Courtroom is a Matt Hardin Law production.
If you've been involved in a car wreck or any other type of personal injury or wrongful death case, check us out at matthardinlaw.com or give us a call at 615-200-1111.